At exactly 9:17 a.m., Dr. Eris Thorne slid a 41-page psychological evaluation across the polished mahogany table toward the mediator. The conference room inside the county courthouse felt more like a refrigerated storage unit than a place where people discussed legal matters. Cold air blasted from vents overhead. The sharp smell of rubbing alcohol lingered beneath the stale scent of coffee that had probably been sitting in a paper carafe since sunrise. Every chair was occupied except the one nearest the door. Mine. Dr. Thorne folded his hands and offered the kind of smile people use when they already believe they've won. Based on my professional assessment, he said, Mrs. Morgan Thayer exhibits severe paranoia, social withdrawal, cognitive detachment, and a persistent inability to distinguish perceived threats from ordinary interactions. The mediator nodded and made a note. My mother dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, her heavy diamond bracelet clicking softly against the wooden table. Richard kept a firm, comforting hand on Julian's shoulder, projecting the flawless image of a heartbroken patriarch, forced to save his damaged daughter from herself. Dr. Thorne adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and confidently stated that my quiet demeanor was a clear symptom of psychological collapse. But I didn't say a word. Silence makes some people uncomfortable. I learned years ago that uncomfortable people often tell you exactly who they are. The mediator glanced toward me. Miss Thayer, do you understand the purpose of today's hearing? I do. That was all I said. Across the table, Julian shifted in his chair. His leased Porsche payment was probably due soon. I knew that because Julian's financial emergencies arrived with the same reliability as federal tax season. He started 3 tech companies in 6 years. One sold custom drone accessories. One claimed it would revolutionize restaurant reservations. The third involved cryptocurrency and somehow lost $412 before producing a single customer. Every venture collapsed in under 10 months, yet somehow every failure was somebody else's fault. Today, apparently, it was mine. Dr. Thorne continued. Mrs. Thayer demonstrates concerning emotional disengagement. During our sessions, she displayed minimal affect and unusual suspicion toward family members attempting to support her. Support. That word floated through the room like a bad joke. Richard lowered his head and rubbed his forehead, as if carrying the burden of a tragic daughter had finally become too much. If there were Academy Awards for family court performances, he would have demanded a Lifetime Achievement Trophy. We've tried everything, Richard said quietly. His voice sounded rehearsed. We only want what's best for Morgan. Vivian reached over and squeezed his hand. The gesture was so perfectly timed it looked choreographed. The mediator offered a sympathetic expression. Dr. Thorne turned another page. The inheritance has unfortunately intensified Miss Thayer's instability. There it was, the real subject. Not mental health, not concern, not family, money, specifically $8,214,000. The number sat quietly inside every sentence being spoken in that room. Nobody wanted to say it too loudly. Greed always sounds better when disguised as compassion. I watched the mediator review the petition: guardianship, financial conservatorship, transfer of authority, temporary emergency control. Interesting language. When people want your property, they rarely call it taking, they call it help. Julian leaned forward. I just want my sister to be okay. His expensive cologne reached my side of the table before his words did. The bottle probably cost more than the monthly electric bill at my house. Not that Julian ever paid his own electric bills for very long. She's been struggling for years, he continued. I worry about her. I looked at him. He immediately looked away. That happened a lot when people lied. Not always, but often enough. The mediator flipped through several pages. Dr. Thorne pointed toward a highlighted section. As documented here, Ms. Thayer experiences persistent distrust of authority figures and demonstrates exaggerated pattern recognition. I almost laughed. Almost. Exaggerated pattern recognition. That was a creative way to describe noticing things, like how Richard's Rolex wasn't the same watch he'd worn 3 months earlier, or how Julian suddenly stopped making eye contact whenever financial documents appeared, or how my mother's concern became dramatically stronger whenever money entered a conversation. Tiny details, tiny patterns, tiny truths. The room remained cold enough that condensation formed on several water glasses. Nobody touched them. Nobody seemed thirsty. Everyone seemed focused on the same goal: convince the court that Morgan Thayer was incapable of managing her own affairs. The mediator folded her hands. Miss Thayer, your family appears deeply concerned about your well-being. I met her eyes. They do appear that way. Julian shifted again. Richard's jaw tightened for half a second. Vivian lowered her gaze. The response wasn't what they wanted. Neither agreement nor resistance. Just observation. The mediator paused. The room became quiet enough for me to hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat. My professional recommendation is immediate conservatorship. There it was, the destination hidden inside 41 pages. One sentence, signature, one ruling. $8 million changes ownership. Richard finally looked directly at me. For a brief moment, the grieving father disappeared. The mask slipped. What I saw underneath wasn't sadness. It wasn't concern. It wasn't love. It was expectation. The confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been purchased. Then the expression vanished as quickly as it appeared. The grieving father returned. The concerned family returned. The performance continued, and as I looked down at the thick evaluation resting in front of me, my eyes settled on a date buried halfway through the report. A single line. A single claim. A single detail that didn't belong. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I turned the page, slowly. I kept my eyes on the report while Dr. Thorne continued reading symptoms that sounded like they had been assembled from a discount catalog of bad stereotypes. Social isolation. Page turn. Difficulty forming trusting relationships. Page turn. Persistent emotional detachment. Page turn. The funny thing about lies is that they usually contain just enough truth to sound believable. I did spend a lot of time alone. I didn't trust many people, and I wasn't exactly the life of the party. The difference was that none of those things made me mentally incompetent. They just made me careful. Across the table, my mother lowered her head and released a soft sigh that deserved its own theater review. The mediator offered another sympathetic nod. Dr. Thorne continued. Richard sat perfectly still. That caught my attention. My father was never still unless money was involved. 7 weeks earlier, Great-Aunt Beatrice had died peacefully in hospice care. She was 89 years old. She weighed less than 90 pounds during her final month. She kept peppermint candies in a glass bowl beside her bed even after she lost interest in eating them herself. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evening for 6 months, I visited her after work. Not because I expected anything, not because I needed anything, because she was family, real family, the kind that existed before money entered the conversation. Most visits lasted 45 minutes, some lasted 3 hours. A few lasted less than 10 when she was exhausted. I helped nurses move furniture. I organized insurance paperwork. I fixed a television remote nobody else could figure out. I listened to stories I'd already heard 12 times, sometimes 13. She always laughed at the same parts. So did I. The rest of the family rarely appeared. Richard stopped visiting after his second trip. The hospice facility was 22 minutes from his house. Apparently that was too far. Julian visited once. He spent most of the visit checking stock prices on his phone. Great-Aunt Beatrice noticed. She noticed everything. That was probably where I got it from. When her attorney read the will 7 weeks ago, the room became so quiet I could hear the air purifier running beside the conference table. The estate totaled approximately $8,214,000. Properties, investments, municipal bonds, several trust accounts, every dollar was left to me. Not divided, not shared, not negotiated, all of it. The attorney explained why. Beatrice had included a personal letter, 3 pages, single-spaced, no legal language, just honesty. She wrote that I was the only family member who consistently showed up when there was nothing to gain. That sentence landed harder than the inheritance itself. Richard didn't speak for nearly 30 seconds. That alone should have triggered a medical study. Then he asked whether the document could be challenged. Not whether Beatrice had suffered. Not whether her wishes were clear. Not whether I was okay. Just whether it could be challenged. The answer was no. His mood changed immediately. A week later, strange conversations started appearing around town. A waitress at a diner I'd visited for years suddenly asked whether I was doing better. A neighbor asked whether I was still receiving treatment. A banker I barely knew offered an awkward smile and told me he was praying for my recovery. Recovery from what? Nobody seemed willing to say. Rumors spread faster than facts, especially in small towns. Soon the story became clear. Morgan wasn't capable. Morgan wasn't stable. Morgan had been damaged by military service. Morgan wasn't thinking clearly. Morgan needed help. The version of me they sold to the community sounded like someone I had never met. The most effective lies are simple, and my family kept theirs simple. Broken soldier. People understood that. People accepted that. Nobody questioned it. After all, I wasn't helping their assumptions. I wore plain gray sweaters. I drove a 12-year-old pickup truck. I lived in a modest house with a monthly mortgage payment lower than Julian's car insurance. I didn't talk about work. I didn't post inspirational quotes online. I didn't advertise accomplishments. To Richard, that meant failure. To Julian, it meant weakness. To my mother, it meant something she could manipulate. The truth never interested them. The truth was inconvenient. The truth was that I wasn't a low-level military record keeper. I wasn't organizing filing cabinets somewhere inside a forgotten government building. I was a Chief Warrant Officer 3 in Army counterintelligence. My job involved identifying deception, financial anomalies, compromised networks, people hiding things, people inventing things, people pretending to be something they weren't. Ironically, my own family fit several professional categories I dealt with every day. I never corrected them. There wasn't much point. Explaining strength to people who only respected volume was a waste of breath. Richard measured intelligence by who spoke the loudest. Julian measured success by who spent the most money. Vivian measured truth by which version benefited her most. None of them would have understood anyway. Dr. Thorne continued reading. The report described me as withdrawn and suspicious. The mediator highlighted several passages. My family nodded at all the appropriate moments. The performance remained impressively coordinated. Then again, they had been practicing for weeks, maybe longer. The mediator looked toward me. Do you disagree with any of these findings, Miss Thayer? I lowered my gaze back to the report. Most people's assumed silence meant surrender. That misunderstanding had been useful throughout my entire career. No, I said calmly. Julian almost smiled. Richard relaxed slightly. Vivian squeezed her handkerchief. They thought agreement meant defeat. They thought the story was working. I turned another page, then another. Halfway through the report, a date appeared near the bottom of the paper. October 12th. A clinical observation, a mandatory evaluation, conducted in Atlanta. My eyes remained fixed on the line. The room faded into the background. The cold air, the coffee smell, the quiet whispers. All of it disappeared, because for the first time that morning, the report had stopped being insulting. Now it was interesting. My thumb stopped against the edge of page 14. The report remained open in front of me while Dr. Thorne continued speaking, as if nothing had changed. Patients experiencing severe paranoia often create elaborate explanations to avoid accepting reality. The mediator nodded again. Julian folded his arms. My mother lowered her eyes. The performance continued. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was reading. Specifically, I was reading a date. October 12th. The report stated that I attended a mandatory psychological evaluation at a private clinic in Atlanta, Georgia. According to Dr. Thorne's notes, I arrived late. I appeared agitated. I demonstrated distrust toward medical personnel. I exhibited irrational fears about being monitored. The report even included a detailed description of my clothing. Gray sweater, black slacks, brown leather shoes. Very thorough, very professional, very impossible. Because on October 12th, I wasn't in Atlanta. I was 4,600 miles away. I knew the exact date because military schedules don't leave much room for confusion, especially classified ones. October 12th had started inside a secure briefing facility in Stuttgart, Germany. I remembered the room. Windowless, restricted access, electronic devices prohibited. 6 people seated around a conference table, reviewing financial movement across multiple international networks. The briefing began at 08:30 local time. It ended at 14:40 Stufen. I remembered because one of the analysts complained about missing lunch. Twice. People remember strange details, especially when they've spent years separating useful information from background noise. I stared at the report again. The Atlanta evaluation allegedly took place at 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time. At that exact moment, I had been sitting inside a classified briefing discussing suspicious financial transfers moving through shell corporations in Eastern Europe. There were attendance records, security logs, travel orders, military transportation manifests, electronic access reports, dozens of independent records proving my location. The evaluation wasn't mistaken. It wasn't inaccurate. It was fabricated, completely. A small silence settled inside my head. Not shock, not panic. Something colder. Counterintelligence teaches you to recognize the exact moment a situation changes categories. One moment you're dealing with suspicion, the next moment you're dealing with evidence. This was evidence. I slowly turned another page. Then another. The report became easier to read once I understood what it actually was. Not a medical document, a script. Every paragraph followed the same pattern: claim, opinion, conclusion. No supporting data, no diagnostic testing, no treatment history, no independent verification. The kind of work that looked impressive until someone checked it. Dr. Thorne was still talking. He sounded very confident. People usually do when they assume nobody in the room knows more than they do. Unfortunately for him, evaluating deception happened to be my profession. I noticed something else. The language repeated. Several observations used identical wording, different dates, different circumstances, same phrases. That suggested the report had been assembled quickly, possibly copied from previous evaluations, possibly written for someone else before being modified. Lazy work, expensive apparently, but still lazy. Across the table, Richard appeared relaxed. That bothered me more than the forged report itself, because confidence requires a reason. My father wasn't a risk taker. He never gambled unless he believed the outcome was controlled. For him to sit here this calmly meant he thought the foundation underneath this fraud was solid, which meant planning, preparation, coordination. This wasn't a desperate last-minute idea. This had been developing for weeks, maybe months. I looked toward Julian. His expression told the same story. Not nervous, not worried, certain, as if he had already spent the inheritance in his head. That made sense. His last startup had collapsed 9 months earlier. According to public records, several lawsuits remained unresolved. One creditor alone was seeking over $318. Julian needed money, Richard needed money, the dealership needed money. The inheritance had become their solution, and I had become their obstacle. The realization wasn't emotional, it was structural. Like seeing the blueprint hidden underneath a building. Every rumor, every conversation, every concerned phone call, every whisper around town, all connected. The story about the damaged veteran wasn't random. It was preparation. They needed the community to believe something before they brought it into court. That way, the accusation would feel familiar. People trust familiar lies. A courthouse employee entered briefly and delivered additional paperwork to the mediator. The interruption lasted less than 30 seconds. Nobody paid much attention. I used the moment to study Dr. Thorne. Expensive suit, polished shoes, luxury watch, perfect posture. Everything carefully maintained. A man who invested heavily in appearances. Those types often assume everyone else does the same. He probably believed I fit the image they had created. Quiet, withdrawn, intimidated, easy target, easy signature, easy victory. He had no idea what he was sitting across from. Not because of rank, not because of military experience, because of training. Counterintelligence isn't about catching dramatic movie villains. Most of the job involves patient observation, watching people lie, watching them repeat those lies, watching them become comfortable inside those lies. Eventually, comfortable people make mistakes. This report was already one mistake. There would be more. The mediator finally looked toward me again. Mims, Thayer, are you following the discussion? Yes, my answer was calm, nothing more. Richard glanced at me. Maybe he expected anger, maybe he expected tears, maybe he expected some emotional reaction that would support the report. Instead, I turned another page. The room remained cold. The smell of stale coffee still lingered in the air. Dr. Thorne resumed reading. Julian shifted in his chair. My mother squeezed her handkerchief. And for the first time that morning, I understood exactly what they were trying to do. This wasn't about inheritance law anymore. This wasn't even about greed. They were attempting to use a forged medical diagnosis to strip away my legal autonomy. My right to manage my finances, my right to make decisions, my right to control my own life. They weren't trying to take my money. They were trying to take the person who owned it. The distinction mattered, a lot. Because financial fraud can sometimes be negotiated. A deliberate attack on someone's basic rights cannot. I closed the report gently and rested my hand on top of it. The sound barely registered in the room. Nobody reacted. Nobody realized the hearing had already changed. Because while they were busy presenting their case, I had just identified the first crack in the entire operation. And once I saw the crack, I couldn't stop looking for the rest of the structure hidden behind it. I let my hand rest on the closed report, while Dr. Thorne continued building a case that no longer mattered. Once you discover a document is fraudulent, you stop reading it as evidence. You start reading it as a map. Every lie points toward the person who created it. Every false statement leaves fingerprints. Every fabricated story requires infrastructure. 3 days before this hearing, a courier delivered the guardianship petition to my front door at 4:38 p.m. I signed for it, thanked him, walked inside, made coffee, and read every page. Most people expected outrage from someone receiving legal paperwork that claimed they were mentally incompetent. They probably expected screaming, phone calls, threats, emotional speeches. Instead, I treated it like an intelligence packet, because that's what it was. Just from a different battlefield. The petition itself wasn't impressive. The supporting documents were medical evaluations, affidavits, witness statements, financial recommendations, too organized, too coordinated, too expensive. A legitimate concern doesn't usually arrive wrapped inside a professionally assembled legal campaign. An operation does. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight reviewing every page. My house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car outside. Around 11:26 p.m., I reached a conclusion. I wasn't dealing with worried relatives. I was dealing with a hostile network. The fact that we shared a last name didn't change the analysis. The next morning, I powered up a secure terminal in my home office. Most people assumed my work stayed at military installations. They would have been surprised by how much analysis can happen from a properly secured system. At 06:12 a.m., I placed one encrypted call. The call lasted 4 minutes and 38 seconds. The person who answered was Desmond Hayes, retired CD, former mentor, former investigator, one of the few people I trusted without needing a second verification. Desmond picked up on the second ring. "Morning, Morgan. I need eyes on something." "Family, yes." There was a short pause. "That's usually worse." He wasn't wrong. Criminals at least admit they're after your money. Family members often convince themselves they're acting out of love. That makes them unpredictable. I explained the situation. Not emotionally, professionally. A forged psychiatric evaluation, a guardianship petition, a suspicious timeline, possible financial motive. Desmond listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked one question. What outcome are they trying to achieve? Control of an $8 million estate. Another pause. Then he sighed. That'll do it. The call ended 2 minutes later. No dramatic promises, no speeches, no guarantees. Just two professionals identifying an objective. While Richard spent the following days presenting himself as a concerned father, Desmond started pulling records. Quietly, patiently, legally. That's the thing about financial fraud. People think the hard part is stealing money. The hard part is hiding where it came from. Every transfer leaves a trail. Every account has a history. Every transaction creates a footprint, especially when desperate people rush. Desmond worked from his office above a small insurance agency downtown. The place looked boring enough to lower your blood pressure, which was exactly why he liked it. Nobody notices boring. 48 hours before the hearing, he called me. Found something. That was all he said. Desmond wasn't a man who wasted words. An email arrived 30 seconds later. Inside was a preliminary financial trace, Richard's business account. Thayer Prestige Motors, current condition, deteriorating. The numbers were ugly. Vendor payments delayed, inventory financing strained, credit obligations increasing, operating cash shrinking. The dealership wasn't struggling. It was bleeding. I reviewed the records carefully. 3 months earlier, Richard had withdrawn money from a business line of credit. 2 months earlier, another withdrawal. Then another. Then another. The pattern looked familiar, temporary patches, short-term survival, the financial equivalent of putting duct tape on a leaking pipe. Then Desmond highlighted a transaction. $45,000, wire transfer origin, Thayer Prestige Motors operating account, destination, consulting firm. The company name sounded generic. Too generic, which immediately interested me. Legitimate businesses usually spend money advertising who they are. Shell companies prefer anonymity. Desmond had already investigated further. The consulting firm occupied a rented mailbox in another state. No employees, no active website, no operational history, no visible business activity. The ownership records traced back through multiple registrations. Most people would have stopped there. Desmond didn't. 2 more layers down, he found the actual owner, Dr. Eris Thorne. I stared at the screen for several seconds, not because I was surprised, because the confirmation mattered. Suspicion becomes strategy once evidence arrives. The forged report suddenly made perfect sense. The timing, the confidence, the coordination. Someone had been paid. 45,000 reasons to diagnose me as incompetent. I called Desmond immediately. Can you verify it? Already did. Twice? 3 times. That sounded like Desmond. Trust, but verify. Then verify again. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, a lawn service truck passed my house. The ordinary sound felt strangely comforting, because inside the document sitting on my desk, everything had changed. The situation was no longer a family dispute. It was a conspiracy. A simple one. A greedy one. But still a conspiracy. Richard needed money, Julian needed money, Dr. Thorne wanted money, and somehow they convinced themselves that I was the easiest part of the equation. Maybe because I rarely argued. Maybe because I stayed quiet. Maybe because they spent years mistaking restraint for weakness. People make that mistake often, particularly loud people. I looked again at the financial records spread across my desk. The evidence was growing. The picture was becoming clearer. And somewhere between the wire transfers, shell companies, fabricated diagnoses, and legal filings, I realized something that should have been obvious as much earlier. Sharing bloods with someone does not create an unlimited line of credit against your dignity. Family can ask for help. Family can ask for forgiveness. Family can ask for another chance. What they cannot ask for is ownership, not of your future, not of your choices, and certainly not of your life. By the time I shut down the terminal that night, I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. I needed judgment. Because in less than 72 hours, everyone involved in this operation would walk into a courthouse believing they controlled the story. And I intended to learn exactly how much of that confidence was borrowed. Julian's chair scraped softly against the floor as he leaned closer to me. The mediator had called for a brief pause in the proceedings, hoping everyone could find common ground before moving forward. Common ground. That phrase appears frequently when someone wants you to surrender politely. The conference room somehow felt even colder than before. A courthouse employee had replaced the coffee during the break, but the fresh pot didn't improve the smell. It only added a stronger layer of bitterness to the room. The mediator folded her hands. Thayer, I strongly encourage you to consider the proposed conservatorship. Based on the information presented, it appears to be in your best interest. There it was again. Best interest. The favorite phrase of people trying to make decisions for someone else. Julian seized the opportunity immediately. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if we were sharing a private family moment. The expensive cologne hit me first. Then came the performance. Come on, Morgan, he said softly. Just sign the temporary conservatorship. He glanced toward Richard before looking back at me. Let Dad handle the stress so you can finally rest. Rest, interesting choice of words. Julian hadn't rested a day in his life. He simply moved from one financial disaster to the next. 3 years earlier, he'd convinced investors to fund an artificial intelligence startup that somehow spent $187 on office furniture before producing a working product. The office furniture survived longer than the company, yet now he was offering financial wisdom. I said nothing. That seemed to encourage him. People often mistake silence for agreement. You don't need all this pressure, Julian continued. Dad can manage everything, the investments, the properties, the legal work. Everything. A very revealing word. Not some things, everything. Across the table, Richard maintained the expression of a concerned father carrying an impossible burden. The act would have been more convincing if I hadn't already seen the financial records, or the wire transfer, or the shell company. Context changes everything. Without context, he looked supportive. With context, he looked like a man trying to repossess $8 million. Vivian decided it was her turn. She slowly reached across the table toward my hand. The movement was perfectly calibrated. Gentle, careful, maternal. If someone had taken a photograph at that exact moment, it would have looked like the cover of a parenting magazine. I allowed her hand to touch mine. She squeezed lightly. Then her voice cracked. Remarkable timing. Honey, she whispered. The tears appeared instantly. Professional-level tears. I just want my daughter back. There was a time when that sentence might have affected me. Not because it was true, because I wanted it to be true. People spend years believing certain lies when those lies come from family. Eventually, reality becomes too expensive to ignore. My mother squeezed my hand again. I miss who you used to be. That was another interesting statement. mostly because she couldn't describe who I supposedly used to be. Neither could Richard. Neither could Julian. The version of Morgan they claimed to miss had never actually existed. It was a fictional character they created. A quieter version. A weaker version. A version that never challenged them. The mediator watched the exchange with obvious sympathy. She wasn't stupid. She simply lacked information. From her perspective, this looked exactly like a worried family trying to help a struggling relative. The trap worked because it was designed to appear reasonable. The best deceptions rarely look dramatic. They look responsible. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses and joined the conversation. Mrs. Thayer, accepting temporary conservatorship doesn't mean surrendering your independence. That almost made me smile. Almost. The report claims I suffered from paranoia. Yet here sat the author of that report, financially connected to the people attempting to control my estate. Sometimes reality has a sense of humor. Richard finally spoke. His voice was measured, calm, practiced. Morgan, nobody wants to take anything from you. That statement was technically accurate. They didn't want to take something from me. They wanted to take everything, a subtle distinction, but an important one. The mediator opened a folder and slid a document toward me. Temporary conservatorship agreement, 14 pages, several signature lines, legal authority transferred immediately upon approval, investment authority, property authority, financial authority. Everything. The paperwork was already prepared. That told me something. Confident people prepare paperwork in advance. Very confident people prepare paperwork before a hearing even begins. Julian noticed me reading. His shoulders relaxed. He thought I was considering it. Richard noticed too. A tiny shift in posture, a fraction of an inch, but enough. Hope. Not hope for me. Hope for the money. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, not physically. Psychologically. Everyone around the table was participating in the same fiction. The concerned father, the grieving mother, the supportive brother, the objective psychiatrist, the cautious mediator. Every role perfectly assigned. Every line perfectly delivered. And every single one of them believed the performance was working. That's what made the situation dangerous. People become careless when they think they've already won. Julian leaned closer again. So what do you say? His voice carried genuine excitement now, not concern, not compassion, excitement. The finish line was finally visible, the inheritance, the bailout, the solution. Everything he thought was about to become his. I slowly placed the conservatorship document on top of Dr. Thorne's evaluation. Then I aligned both stacks neatly. A habit from years of handling sensitive files. Order matters, especially before chaos. Julian interpreted the gesture exactly the way I expected. His smile appeared. Small, confident, premature. Richard looked relieved. Vivian dabbed another perfectly timed tear. Even Dr. Thorne seemed more relaxed. The entire room had reached the same conclusion. Morgan Thayer was exhausted. Morgan Thayer was intimidated. Morgan Thayer was overwhelmed by legal language and professional opinions. Morgan Thayer was finally ready to stop fighting. The strange thing was that none of them realized there had never been a fight. Not yet. Because while they were busy convincing themselves the trap had snapped shut, I was quietly measuring how much weight the trap could hold before it broke. The confidence in the room followed us into Judge Caldwell's courtroom later that afternoon. Not my confidence, theirs. The hearing room was larger than the conference room downstairs, but somehow it felt even more crowded. Attorneys organized folders at counsel tables. The bailiff moved quietly between rows. Spectators filled several benches in the gallery. The low hum of whispered conversations floated through the room until Judge Harrison Caldwell entered and everyone stood. Judge Caldwell had a reputation. Most judges disliked dishonesty. Judge Caldwell treated dishonesty like a personal insult. That detail would become important. For now, however, my family appeared completely comfortable. Richard sat at the petitioner's table wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Vivian maintained the same expression of exhausted concern she had worn all morning. Julian sat in the gallery with one ankle resting on the opposite knee, looking like a man already browsing luxury real estate listings in his imagination. The conservatorship petition sat neatly organized in front of them. Their evidence, their witnesses, their plan, everything seemed ready. Judge Caldwell reviewed several documents before looking toward Richard. Mr. Thayer, please take the stand. Richard stood immediately. Prepared people always move quickly. He adjusted his jacket, walked to the witness stand, and took the oath without hesitation. Then the performance began. I love my daughter, a classic opening, simple, safe, difficult to challenge. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment before continuing. This situation has been devastating for our family. The judge listened without expression. Richard continued. Morgan wasn't always like this. There it was, the fictional version of me again, the version they had been selling for weeks, maybe months, the version damaged beyond repair, the version incapable of managing her own affairs, the version that conveniently required someone else to take control of $8 million. Richard's voice softened. When she returned from military service, things changed. Returned from military service. Interesting wording. He said it as though I had spent years wandering through explosions while forgetting where I parked my car. The reality was much less dramatic, and significantly less useful to his story. She became distant, Richard said, withdrawn, suspicious, unable to trust anyone. He glanced toward me. The judge followed his gaze. I simply sat there, listening, observing, taking notes. Richard mistook stillness for weakness. A common mistake. Your Honor, Morgan cannot handle the responsibility that comes with an estate of this size. He paused. Then came the line he had clearly rehearsed. She doesn't even know how to balance a checkbook. Julian laughed. Not loudly, just enough. A quick smirk followed. Several people in the gallery exchanged looks. Richard pressed forward. She's completely detached from reality. The statement hung in the room for a moment. I wrote something on a legal pad. Not because I needed the note, because it unsettles liars when their audience starts documenting details. Richard continued describing my supposed inability to function. According to him, I struggled with financial decisions, struggled with responsibility, struggled with ordinary life. The portrait he painted was fascinating, mostly because it bore no resemblance to the person sitting 10 feet away. Judge Caldwell reviewed a document. Mr. Thayer, have you personally witnessed your daughter mishandling significant financial matters? Many times. A dangerous answer. Specific questions create specific risks. What examples can you provide? Richard immediately launched into a story about my old pickup truck. Apparently, driving a 12-year-old truck instead of purchasing a luxury vehicle demonstrated poor judgment. That was genuinely his argument. I almost admired the confidence, not the intelligence. Just the confidence. He explained how I lived modestly, despite having a stable income, how I avoided unnecessary spending, how I rarely discussed investments. Everything he described sounded suspiciously like responsible adulthood. Yet somehow he presented it as evidence of instability. Judge Caldwell remained expressionless, which was never a good sign. Experienced judges rarely reveal what they're thinking. The smart ones let people keep talking, and talking, and talking. Eventually someone says too much. Richard seemed determined to become that person. The inheritance itself proves the problem. Judge Caldwell looked up. Explain. Richard nodded. If Morgan were mentally healthy, she would understand that family resources should benefit the entire family. There it was. Not concern, not protection, not guardianship. The money, finally. The real argument accidentally is escaped. The judge leaned back slightly. Not much. Just enough for me to notice. Richard didn't. He kept talking. People often become reckless when they think they're winning. My son has business obligations. Julian straightened proudly in the gallery. Wrong reaction. Very wrong reaction. My wife and I are getting older. Vivian lowered her head dramatically. Richard continued. Managing those assets ourselves would simply make more sense. There it was again. The word, assets. Not Morgan's inheritance, not Morgan's property, not Morgan's legal estate. Assets. Already reclassified in his mind as something he controlled. Judge Caldwell made another note. A longer one this time. That caught my attention. Richard never noticed. He was too busy enjoying himself. The courtroom had become his stage. His story was working. At least he thought it was. Dr. Thorne sat confidently at the petitioner's table. Vivian occasionally dabbed at her eyes. Julian looked like a man waiting for the keys to a new house. The entire group shared the same assumption. The paperwork was strong. The diagnosis was official. The court would follow procedure. The judge would sign. The inheritance would move under conservatorship. Game over. What they didn't understand was that confidence built on fraud creates a very specific kind of blindness. You stop checking your assumptions. You stop questioning your evidence. You stop looking for threats. Because you've convinced yourself the outcome is guaranteed. Richard finally finished his testimony. Judge Caldwell thanked him and reviewed several documents. The courtroom settled into silence, the kind that arrives just before something important happens. Julian leaned back in his seat again, smiling. Vivian relaxed visibly. Even Dr. Thorne appeared satisfied. I looked across the room at all three of them, then at the thick folder resting beside me, then at the courtroom doors behind the gallery. Because while everyone else was waiting for the judge to rule, I was waiting for someone else to arrive. And unlike the story Richard had spent all afternoon telling, I knew exactly which version of reality was about to enter the room. I rose from my chair just as Judge Caldwell reached for the file in front of him. Your Honor, I said calmly, before the court reaches a decision, I'd like to submit one final piece of documentation regarding my mental state. Richard sighed loudly, not because he was annoyed, because he wanted everyone else to know he was annoyed. The performance never stopped. Judge Caldwell looked up. What documentation? Evidence relevant to the credibility of the psychiatric evaluation. The courtroom became very still. Dr. Thorne shifted slightly in his seat. The movement was small, but it was the first genuine movement I'd seen from him all day. Richard rolled his eyes. Julian laughed under his breath. Neither seemed concerned. Why would they be? They believed the difficult part was over. Their witnesses had testified. Their expert had spoken. Their paperwork looked official. As far as they knew, I was standing alone. Judge Caldwell glanced toward the courtroom doors. Proceed. The heavy oak doors opened. The sound echoed through the room. Every head turned. Desmond Hayes walked inside without rushing, without hesitation, without the slightest interest in the reactions around him. Several people in the gallery exchanged confused looks. Richard frowned. Julian's smirk faded slightly. Vivian stopped dabbing her eyes. Desmond wore a dark suit that looked expensive only because it fit properly. His gray hair was neatly trimmed. His expression remained neutral. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like someone who spent 30 years finding things other people wanted hidden, which was exactly what he had done. The bailiff approached him. Desmond handed over a thick forensic binder. Colored tabs protruded from every side. Bank records, corporate registrations, transaction logs, ownership documents, verification reports, evidence, actual evidence. The binder landed on the clerk's desk with a weight that seemed much heavier than paper should allow. Judge Caldwell opened it. The courtroom remained silent. Richard's confidence finally showed its first crack. What is this? He asked. Nobody answered him. Desmond didn't even look his direction. Judge Caldwell flipped through several pages. Is this and several more? The judge's expression didn't change. That worried me less than if it had. Experienced judges don't show surprise, they simply keep reading. I walked toward the presentation monitor beside the counsel table. My evidence directly addresses the report's conclusions regarding my mental competency. Dr. Thorne straightened. The first signs of tension appeared around his eyes. I connected my laptop. The monitor illuminated. Several attorneys in the gallery leaned forward. The first document appeared on screen, a financial transaction log, simple, clean, easy to understand. The judge looked up. So we're clear, he said. What am I viewing? A verified banking record, Your Honor. The room stayed silent. I advanced to the next page. Highlighted in yellow, one transaction, one date, one amount, $45,000. Wire transfer, origin, Thayer Prestige Motors operating account. Destination, Strategic Behavioral Consulting Group. Several people frowned. The name sounded legitimate. That was the point. Shell companies often choose names that sound boring. Nobody investigates boring. I clicked again. The next document appeared. Corporate ownership records, business registrations, state filings, cross-referenced ownership disclosures. A highlighted sign sat in the center of the page. Dr. Eris Thorne. The room seemed to stop breathing. Richard's head snapped toward Dr. Thorne. Dr. Thorne immediately looked down. Wrong move. Very wrong move. Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses. Doctor, he said. The title sounded unusually sharp. Do you own this company? No answer. The judge repeated the question. Do you own this company? Yes. The response barely left his mouth. The gallery erupted into whispers. The bailiff immediately called for order. Julian stared at the monitor. Vivian looked confused. Richard looked furious. Not at me, at Dr. Thorne. That told me everything. The partnership had just become a liability. Judge Caldwell turned another page inside the binder. When were these funds received? The answer appeared directly beneath the transaction. 23 days before the psychiatric report. 23 days. Not 6 months, not years, not before any concern supposedly developed. 23 days. The timeline was devastating. I clicked forward again. The wire transfer remained visible beside the ownership records. No complicated explanation, no legal jargon, just facts. $45,000 moved from my father's failing dealership into a company owned by the psychiatrist who later diagnosed me as mentally incompetent. Even people with no financial training understood what they were looking at. Richard's face had turned pale. Julian no longer looked relaxed. Dr. Thorne looked like a man desperately calculating whether an emergency exit existed nearby. But we weren't finished, not even close. I opened the next document. My second exhibit concerns the report's factual accuracy. Judge Caldwell nodded. The courtroom monitor changed, a government document appeared. Most of the information had been redacted. Entire sections were blacked out, names removed, locations restricted, operational details concealed. Only essential verification remained visible. Official stamps, authentication codes, travel authorization records, military verification. Judge Caldwell studied the document carefully. So this is my deployment authorization, Your Honor. The judge continued reading. I zoomed in on the relevant section. One date, October 12th. The exact date listed inside Dr. Thorne's evaluation. The exact date he claimed I attended a psychological assessment in Atlanta. The exact date he claimed I demonstrated paranoia and cognitive instability. The exact date his report depended upon. Then I highlighted the location. Stuttgart, Germany.
Not Atlanta.
Germany, thousands of miles away. A classified briefing assignment verified through official military records. The courtroom exploded. People weren't whispering anymore. They were openly talking. Even the court clerk stopped typing for a moment. Judge Caldwell raised a hand. The room immediately quieted. His attention shifted slowly toward Dr. Thorne. The silence that followed felt different from every other silence that day. Earlier silences had been comfortable, controlled, predictable. This one wasn't. This one belonged to people watching reality collapse in real time. Judge Caldwell placed both hands on the bench. Then he looked directly at Dr. Thorne. "Doctor," he said quietly, "would you like to explain how Miss Thayer attended your evaluation in Atlanta while official military records place her inside a secured facility in Germany?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because at that exact moment, the entire foundation underneath their case disappeared, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Nobody answered Judge Caldwell's question. Not Dr. Thorne, not Richard, not Julian. The silence stretched for several seconds, then several more. The kind of silence that only appears after a lie finally runs out of places to hide. Dr. Thorne swallowed hard and adjusted his collar. For the first time all day, he looked exactly like what he was. Not an expert, not an authority figure, not a respected psychiatrist, a man caught. Judge Caldwell waited, patiently. A dangerous thing for a dishonest witness, because the longer people sit inside uncomfortable silence, the more likely they are to make mistakes. Dr. Thorne finally cleared his throat. There may be an administrative discrepancy. That was his choice. Not fraud, not fabrication, not impossible. Administrative discrepancy. The courtroom reacted immediately. Even Judge Caldwell looked unimpressed. The judge picked up the deployment record again. Then he lifted the psychiatric report, one document, then the other, back and forth. The comparison took less than 10 seconds. The conclusion took even less. This evaluation states the respondent physically attended an examination in Atlanta. He placed the report on the bench. The military documentation establishes she was in Germany. Another pause. Judge Caldwell looked directly at Dr. Thorne. Those facts cannot simultaneously be true. No one spoke. Richard stared at the table. Julian looked like someone had suddenly disconnected the power to his future. The confidence that had carried them through the entire day was gone, not weakened. Gone. Judge Caldwell turned toward the bailiff, approached the bench. The bailiff immediately stepped forward. The judge's voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. "I want courtroom security notified immediately." The words landed like concrete. Vivian gasped. Richard's head snapped upward. Dr. Thorne went pale. Judge Caldwell continued. "Based on the evidence presented, this court has substantial reason to believe fraudulent documentation has been submitted during these proceedings." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. The petition for conservatorship is denied in its entirety. Just like that. 41 pages. Weeks of planning, months of manipulation. Gone in one sentence. But the judge wasn't finished. Not even close. He looked toward Dr. Thorne. I am referring this matter to the appropriate licensing authorities and requesting immediate review for perjury and submission of falsified records. The color drained from Dr. Thorne's face so quickly, it looked painful. 2 courtroom security officers entered through a side door. They weren't dramatic, they didn't need to be. Professional consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They arrive quietly. The officers approached Dr. Thorne. For the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely afraid. Then Judge Caldwell shifted his attention toward Richard and Julian. That was somehow worse. The judge opened the forensic binder again. His finger stopped on the wire transfer. $45,000. Consulting fee. A very expensive diagnosis. This court is also referring these financial records to the district attorney's office for investigation regarding possible conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Richard closed his eyes, just for a moment. A small moment. But enough, he knew. The game was over. Julian looked around the courtroom as though someone else might explain how this happened. Nobody volunteered. Funny how quickly allies disappear when consequences arrive. Vivian began crying, real crying. Not the carefully managed tears from earlier. Not the handkerchief performance. Not the trembling voice. Actual tears. Actual panic. Actual fear. She buried her face in her hands. The diamond bracelet clicked softly against the table. The same bracelet that had been clicking all morning while she pretended to mourn a daughter she was actively trying to strip of her rights. The sound felt different now. Smaller somehow. I remained seated until the judge concluded his final instructions. Then I stood. The room was still buzzing with quiet conversations. Attorneys whispered. Spectators stared. Court staff exchanged looks. Nobody paid much attention to me anymore. The story had changed. I was no longer the subject. The fraud was. I picked up my gray coat from the back of my chair. The fabric felt familiar, comfortable. I slipped one arm into the sleeve, then the other, slowly. The same way I approached everything important. No rush, no drama, no victory speech. I buttoned the coat, one button, then another. Then I looked at my father. Richard finally met my eyes, not the confident eyes from earlier. Not the eyes of a man certain he controlled the outcome. These were different, smaller, older, tired. For a moment he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent so much time protecting his ego that he accidentally destroyed his own credibility. He opened his mouth. I don't know what he intended to say. An apology. An excuse. A justification. Maybe all 3. I spoke first, not loudly. Just clearly. True insanity isn't needing help. The room became quiet again. I continued. It's destroying your own daughter to save your ego. Richard said nothing. There wasn't much left to say. The evidence had already spoken. The judge had already ruled. Reality had already arrived. I looked briefly toward Julian. Then toward my mother. Neither met my eyes. That was fine. I wasn't looking for an apology. Apologies don't repair character. People repair character. Or they don't. That choice belongs to them, not me. I turned and walked toward the courtroom doors. Behind me, security officers were still speaking with Dr. Thorne. Court personnel were collecting documents. Attorneys were discussing referrals. The machinery of accountability had begun moving. And for once, none of it required my involvement. The heavy doors opened, then closed behind me. The afternoon air felt cool and clean after hours inside the courthouse. I stood on the front steps for a moment. People hurried past, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Cars moved through traffic. Life continued, as it always does. The strange thing about family betrayal is that people assume the goal is revenge. It isn't. Revenge keeps you connected to the people who hurt you. Survival requires something different. Distance, clarity, boundaries, understanding. I never walked into that courthouse hoping to teach my family a lesson. Lessons only matter when someone wants to learn. What mattered was something much simpler. My dignity, the one thing they had spent weeks trying to negotiate away. The one thing they believed could be transferred through paperwork. The one thing they never actually owned. I started down the courthouse steps. The weight I felt wasn't triumph, it wasn't relief. It wasn't even justice, it was certainty. The certainty that dignity is not an inheritance. It isn't granted by parents, it isn't approved by courts. And it certainly isn't surrendered because someone shares your last name. I hadn't destroyed my family. I hadn't embarrassed them. I hadn't ruined their lives. All I had done was place a mirror in front of them. For the first time, they were forced to look. And that was never my responsibility to fix. The courthouse was already several blocks behind me when I realized something that had nothing to do with money, lawyers, or forged documents. The hardest part of that entire experience wasn't proving that my family lied. The hardest part was accepting that they were willing to. A lot of people think betrayal hurts because of what someone does. In my experience, betrayal hurts because of who does it. If a stranger lies to you, you adjust your expectations. If a stranger tries to take advantage of you, you protect yourself and move on. But when it comes from family, your mind starts looking for alternative explanations. You give people extra chances, then extra chances after those extra chances. Then you start explaining their behavior to yourself. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're having a bad year. Maybe they'll change. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. One lesson I learned far later than I should have is that love can make intelligent people ignore obvious evidence. Not because they're weak, because they're hopeful. Hope is a beautiful thing until it starts arguing with reality. Looking back at the months before the courthouse hearing, I can identify dozens of moments when I should have paid more attention. The rumors around town, the strange questions from neighbors, the sudden concern from people who had never been concerned before. The way my father talked about the inheritance as if it already belonged to him. The way Julian kept discussing financial problems whenever family gatherings happened. The way my mother always seemed more interested in managing appearances than addressing facts. None of those moments were hidden. I saw them. I simply chose to interpret them generously. Many people do the same thing, especially when family is involved. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that loyalty and honesty are the same thing. They aren't. Loyalty is valuable. But loyalty without honesty becomes denial. And denial is expensive. Sometimes it costs money. Sometimes it costs years. Sometimes it costs peace. I spent a long time believing that being a good daughter meant keeping the peace. I thought patience would eventually solve problems. I thought staying quiet would reduce conflict. I thought avoiding difficult conversations was somehow helping the family. The truth is that avoiding reality never strengthens a relationship. It only delays the consequences. One thing Great Aunt Beatrice taught me during those hospice visits was that people become surprisingly honest near the end of life. When she knew her time was limited, she stopped worrying about appearances. She stopped worrying about what sounded polite. She stopped worrying about making everyone comfortable. One afternoon, she looked at me and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. She said, "Some people spend their whole lives protecting relationships that only exist in their imagination." At the time, I smiled and changed the subject. Months later, I finally understood what she meant. A relationship isn't defined by what you hope it is. It's defined by what actually happens. If someone consistently lies to you, that matters. If someone consistently manipulates you, that matters. If someone only shows kindness when they need something, that matters too. Reality doesn't become less real because we dislike it. Another lesson I learned is that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. A lot of people confuse those ideas. You can forgive while giving them unlimited access to your life. You can forgive someone without trusting them with your finances. You can forgive someone without inviting them back into positions where they can hurt you again. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself. Trust is something people earn. Those are completely different things. I know there are people listening to this story right now who are dealing with situations that look different from mine. Maybe nobody is trying to steal an inheritance. Maybe nobody is filing legal paperwork. Maybe nobody is forging medical documents. But some of you are probably dealing with people who constantly make you question your own judgment. Some of you are dealing with family members who use guilt as a tool. Some of you are carrying relationships that survive only because you're doing all the work. And some of you are exhausted because you've spent years trying to become acceptable to people who already decided they don't want to be fair. If that's you, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me earlier. You are not required to sacrifice your dignity to prove your love. You are not required to tolerate mistreatment to prove your loyalty. And you are not required to ignore reality to prove you're a good person. Healthy relationships don't require you to pretend. Healthy relationships don't punish honesty. Healthy relationships don't demand that one person carry all the weight. One of the most important moments in my life didn't happen inside that courtroom. It happened afterward. It happened when I finally stopped asking why my family behaved the way they did. That question had consumed too much energy already. Why they did it no longer mattered. What mattered was accepting that they did. Acceptance isn't surrender. Acceptance is clarity, and clarity gives you something that denial never can: freedom. If there's one lesson I almost learned too late, it's this. People will reveal who they are through patterns long before they reveal it through confessions. Pay attention to the patterns. Not the promises, not the speeches, not the excuses, the patterns. Because eventually, every relationship tells the truth. The only question is whether we're willing to listen when it does. One reason I wanted to share this story is because most people will never walk into a courtroom and discover that a psychiatrist was paid to help steal an inheritance. What happened to me was extreme. What happens to many people every day is much quieter, and sometimes it's even harder to recognize. The reason is simple. Most manipulation doesn't arrive wearing a villain costume. It arrives wearing a familiar face, a family member, a friend, a spouse, a business partner, someone you trust. After the hearing, I received dozens of messages from people who shared their own experiences, different situations, different families, different states, but the same pattern. One woman told me she had spent 12 years lending money to her brother because every emergency sounded temporary.
A medical bill,
A car repair, a rent payment, a business opportunity, a legal problem. Every request came with a promise. Every promise came with an excuse. The money never returned. The emergencies never stopped. Another man explained that his parents expected him to financially support his 2 adult siblings because he happened to earn more money. Every holiday gathering somehow became a discussion about what he owed the family. Not because he had done anything wrong. Because he had been successful. Success had quietly transformed him into the family bank account. I heard from people who were constantly pressured to co-sign loans, people who were expected to sacrifice retirement savings, people who were made to feel guilty for saying no. Different stories, same strategy. The reason these situations become so confusing is because manipulation rarely begins with demands. It usually begins with obligation. Someone reminds you how much they've done for you. Someone reminds you that family should help family. Someone reminds you that good people make sacrifices. And on the surface, those statements sound reasonable. Sometimes they're even true. The problem starts when those principles only flow in one direction. One thing I learned from years in counterintelligence is that patterns matter more than individual events. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can make a mistake. Anyone can need help. But when the same behavior repeats over and over again, you're no longer looking at a mistake. You're looking at a system. And systems tell the truth. If someone only contacts you when they need something, that's a pattern. If someone becomes angry every time you establish a boundary, that's a pattern. If someone constantly portrays themselves as the victim regardless of circumstances, that's a pattern. If someone expects sacrifices they would never make themselves, that's a pattern. Pay attention to patterns. They're much harder to fake than words. One of the most common forms of manipulation involves guilt. Not direct guilt, professional guilt. The kind that's been practiced for years. It sounds like this. I guess I just care more than everyone else. I never thought you'd treat family this way. After everything we've done for you, I was only trying to help. Notice something interesting. None of those statements address the actual issue. Instead, they try to make you defend yourself. That's not communication. That's strategy. People who genuinely care about solving problems focus on facts. People who want control focus on emotions. Another lesson I want to share is this. Watch how people respond when you say no. That single word reveals more about character than almost anything else. Reasonable people may be disappointed. They may disagree. They may ask questions. But they respect your right to make decisions. Manipulative people react differently. They become angry. They become insulting. They become dramatic. Or they suddenly discover reasons why your boundary is selfish. The boundary itself isn't the problem. The loss of control is. For many years, I believed that being kind meant being available, always understanding, always accommodating. That belief caused more problems than I care to admit, because kindness without boundaries eventually turns into permission. And permission attracts people who are looking for someone to use. I also want to talk about something practical. Protect your financial information. Protect your legal documents. Protect your accounts. Protect your records. Some people hear that advice and immediately think I'm talking about strangers. I'm not. Most financial exploitation doesn't come from strangers. It comes from people who already know you. People who already know where you live. People who already know your habits. People who already know what you're willing to tolerate. Trust is important, but trust should never replace verification. That's true in business. It's true in relationships. And it's definitely true when money is involved. One of the healthiest phrases I ever learned was this. Let me think about it. Simple, polite, effective. Manipulative people often create urgency because urgency reduces critical thinking. They want immediate decisions, immediate signatures, immediate commitments. Give yourself time. Time reveals things. Pressure hides them. Most importantly, remember that kindness and weakness are not the same thing. Compassion and surrender are not the same thing. Generosity and self-destruction are not the same thing. You can be a caring person while still protecting yourself. You can help others without becoming responsible for their choices. You can love people without giving them unlimited access to your resources, your peace, or your future. That's not selfishness. That's adulthood. And if there's one practical lesson my experience taught me, it's this. The people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries. The people who only care about what they can get from you will resent them. Pay attention to which group gets upset when you start protecting yourself. That answer tells you almost everything you need to know. There's one thing I want to clear up before this story ends. Some people will hear everything that happened and assume this was a story about winning the inheritance, winning the court case, winning the argument, winning against my family. I understand why people might see it that way. But that's not how I see it. The court ruling mattered. The evidence mattered. Protecting my rights mattered. But none of those things were the most important part. The most important part happened long before the judge denied the conservatorship. It happened the moment I stopped letting other people define who I was. That may sound simple. It isn't. A surprising number of people spend years living inside identities created by someone else. Maybe a parent told them they weren't capable. Maybe a spouse convinced them they were selfish for having boundaries. Maybe a sibling constantly treated them as the family problem. Maybe an employer convinced them they were lucky just to be there. Over time, some people stop questioning those labels. They start carrying them. They start defending them. Eventually, they start believing them. That process is more dangerous than losing money. Money can be replaced. Time can sometimes be recovered. Confidence can be rebuilt. But when someone convinces you to distrust your own judgment, they gain access to something far more valuable, your ability to make decisions. That is exactly why manipulation often begins with doubt. Before people can control your choices, they usually try to weaken your trust in yourself. They tell you that you're overreacting. They tell you that you're confused. They tell you that you're being unreasonable. They tell you that nobody else sees what you see. If that sounds familiar, pay attention. Because healthy people may disagree with you. Manipulative people try to disconnect you from your own reality. There is a difference. One of the things I learned from my years in counterintelligence is that reality doesn't care about popularity. Reality doesn't conduct elections. Reality doesn't take surveys. Reality remains true even when an entire room disagrees with it. The evidence in that courtroom was true before anyone believed it. It remained true while everyone doubted it. And it was still true after the judge confirmed it. The same principle applies to life. Just because other people don't acknowledge your experience doesn't mean your experience isn't real. Just because someone dismisses your concerns doesn't mean your concerns are invalid. And just because a group agrees on a lie doesn't magically transform it into truth. That lesson applies far beyond family relationships. It applies to friendships, business partnerships, romantic relationships, workplaces, everywhere. One reason people struggle with boundaries is because boundaries are often misunderstood. Some people think boundaries are punishment. They're not. Some people think boundaries are revenge. They're not. Some people think boundaries are walls. They're not. Healthy boundaries are simply instructions. They tell people how to participate in your life. That's all. The people who respect those instructions usually remain. The people who become angry about those instructions usually reveal something important. For many years, I worried that creating boundaries would make me appear cold. I worried people would misunderstand me. I worried people would think I was selfish. What I eventually discovered is that boundaries don't damage healthy relationships. They reveal unhealthy ones. That realization changed everything. I also want to say something to anyone who has recently experienced betrayal. Don't make the mistake of measuring your value by someone else's treatment of you. That is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. Someone else's dishonesty is not proof that you were foolish. Someone else's greed is not proof that you lacked worth. Someone else's betrayal is not proof that you deserved it. Their behavior belongs to them. Your value belongs to you. Keep those things separate. You'll save yourself years of unnecessary pain. If I could sit across from every person listening to this story, I'd tell them one final thing. Trust yourself more, not blindly, not arrogantly, but honestly. If something feels wrong, investigate it. If a relationship constantly drains you, pay attention. If someone's actions repeatedly contradict their words, believe the actions. And if protecting your dignity causes someone to become angry, ask yourself why your dignity threatens them in the first place. That question alone can reveal a lot. As for me, life continued after the courthouse. The inheritance remained protected. The legal process moved forward. People talked. People speculated. People chose sides. That's what people do. Eventually, the noise faded. It always does. What remained was something much more valuable than any financial account. Peace. Not perfect peace, just honest peace. The kind that arrives when your actions finally match your values. The kind that arrives when you stop negotiating with reality. The kind that arrives when you stop asking permission to respect yourself. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. I hope you didn't just hear a story about a family conflict. I hope you found something useful for your own life. Because the lesson was never about $8 million. The lesson was never about courtrooms. The lesson was never even about betrayal. The lesson is this: boundaries are not selfish. Truth is not betrayal. And self-respect does not require anyone else's approval. If this story reminded you of something you've experienced, share it in the comments. Your story might help someone else realize they aren't alone. And if you enjoy stories that explore real human values, difficult choices, and lessons we can apply to everyday life, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We release new stories every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Until the next story, take care of yourself, protect your peace, and never let anyone convince you that your dignity is negotiable.